It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, a beautiful spring morning filled with sunshine, birds chirping, and a sense of excitement in the air. The bride, dressed in an elegant white gown, walked down the aisle with her heart full of love and hope. Her family and friends filled the seats, watching her with admiration. It was her big day. She had dreamed of this moment for years, and everything was supposed to be perfect. The man she loved was waiting for her at the altar, and they were about to make promises to each other that would last a lifetime. As she neared the altar, she saw him standing there. The groom. He was handsome, tall, and had a smile that made her heart race every time. He looked at her, but there was something off. His smile wasn't the same. It was almost forced. The guests smiled at the sight of the beautiful couple coming together. She could feel the love in the room. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as she reached the altar, the groom's expression changed completely. His face grew tense, his eyes cold. She was puzzled. What had gone wrong? She reached out for his hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes filled with uncertainty. The room fell silent. The priest asked if they had any vows to share, and the bride spoke her words softly, her voice filled with love. She looked at him, waiting for him to say his vows. But when he opened his mouth, it wasn't love that came out. It was something cruel. "I can't do this," he said, his voice clear but cold. This was a mistake. The crowd was silent, unsure of what was happening. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The groom took another step back. His eyes met hers, but there was no love, only a look of frustration. "I thought I could go through with it," he continued. "But this whole thing is just too much. I can't marry you." The bride was frozen in shock. Her entire world seemed to crash down in that moment. Her chest tightened as the words echoed in her mind. He was rejecting her, in front of everyone. The guests, her family, all watching in disbelief as the groom humiliated her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her dream wedding, her perfect day, was falling apart. The groom didn't even look sorry. His face was filled with something more like frustration than regret. "I don't love you," he added, his words sharper than before. "I don't know why I ever thought I could." Her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. The priest stood silently, unsure of what to do next. The guests began to murmur, unsure of whether this was some kind of joke. But it wasn't. The groom turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty church as he left her there, abandoned. The bride's body trembled with shock and heartbreak. She was alone, rejected by the man she thought would be by her side forever. Her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of for so long, was over. Not with a celebration, not with promises, but with a painful silence. The room was filled with sympathy, but none of that could heal the deep wound in her heart. Her dreams had crumbled in front of her eyes. The days after the wedding disaster felt like a blur. The bride was in a state of shock. It was hard for her to believe what had happened. How could someone she loved so deeply leave her like that? The pain was too much to bear, and for days she stayed in her room, avoiding the world outside. She didn't want to face anyone. She couldn't. The humiliation was still fresh in her mind. Her family and friends tried to offer support, but no words seemed to help. Her mother called her every day, but all she could do was cry. Her friends sent flowers and comforting messages, but the words didn't ease the hurt. How could anyone understand what she was feeling? How could anyone understand the sting of being rejected in such a public and painful way? Meanwhile, the groom didn't seem to care. He vanished without a trace, not contacting her at all. There were no apologies, no attempts to explain his actions. It was as though he had erased her from his life completely. She couldn't understand it. How could someone who once claimed to love her do this? The anger she felt started to build up, but it was mixed with sadness and confusion. She wanted answers, but she had no idea where to find them. Weeks passed, and though her heart was still broken, life had to go on. She had no choice but to return to work. Every morning, she forced herself out of bed, pretending like nothing had happened. She put on a brave face for her colleagues and smiled as if everything was fine. But inside, she felt empty. Every small task, every word spoken, felt like a huge weight. Her world had been turned upside down, and no one seemed to understand the pain she was carrying. At work, people treated her kindly, but she could see the pity in their eyes. It was clear that everyone knew about what had happened at the wedding. The story had spread quickly, and now she felt like the whole world was talking about her. The whispers, the glances, the sympathetic smiles. It was all too much. She wished she could just disappear, escape the constant reminder of what she had lost. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let this defeat her. She couldn't let this man's cruelty define her. She had spent so many years dreaming of a life with him. And now she had to find a way to dream again. Only this time, for herself. So, little by little, she began to pick up the pieces. She started by focusing on her career. She had always been talented, always been hardworking. And now was the time to prove it. She threw herself into her work, spending long hours in the office, doing what she loved. Slowly, the pain started to fade, just a little. She began to feel a spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility for the future. Her friends encouraged her to go out, to meet new people, but she wasn't ready for that yet. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. For now, the most important thing was to focus on herself, to rebuild the woman she had almost lost in the chaos of the wedding day. Every day felt like a new challenge. Some days were easier than others, but no matter how hard it got, she reminded herself she was strong, she would heal. And one day, she would look back at this time and realize how far she had come. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Slowly, the bride began to feel the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders, though the scars still remained. She had found herself in a place she never expected, alone and heartbroken. But she refused to let that define her. She knew that in order to move forward, she needed to let go of the past. It wasn't easy, but every small step forward gave her a sense of strength. Her first challenge was returning to her job. The thought of facing her colleagues after everything that had happened made her nervous. She wasn't sure how they would treat her, what they would think, or whether they would look at her with pity. But when she walked back into the office, something surprising happened. Her coworkers greeted her with warm smiles, and no one mentioned the wedding disaster. It was as if they understood that she didn't want to talk about it. Instead, they treated her with the same respect and kindness they always had. She threw herself into her work, focusing on her goals and her passions. She was determined to show herself, and the world, that she was more than the woman who had been left at the altar. The workplace became a place where she could rebuild her confidence, one project at a time. As she proved her abilities, something within her began to shift. She started to see her worth, not through the eyes of her former fiancé, but through her own eyes. Months passed, and the feelings of betrayal and hurt were still there, but they didn't consume her like they used to. She no longer let the memories of that painful day haunt her. The wedding dress was put away, tucked into a box at the back of her closet, but she no longer felt the need to look at it. She had stopped letting the pain of her past control her future. One evening, she found herself in the company of old friends. They invited her out for dinner, a small gathering at a cozy restaurant where they could all relax and catch up. She hesitated at first, not sure if she was ready to put herself back out there. But as she sat around the table, listening to their laughter and sharing stories, she realized how much she had missed these moments. For the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. The woman who had been joyful, who had smiled and laughed without worry. Her friends were supportive and encouraging, never mentioning the painful memories of the past. Instead, they celebrated the woman she had become, the strong, independent, and successful woman who was determined to move forward. One friend even complimented her on how much she had grown in the last year, remarking on how she seemed more confident, more certain of who she was. And she was. The woman who had walked away from the altar with a broken heart had transformed into someone new. She wasn't the same, and she didn't want to be. She had learned the value of self-respect, the importance of putting herself first, and the strength to keep going even when life didn't go as planned. As time went on, the memories of the groom faded, replaced by new goals and dreams. She realized that she didn't need him or anyone else to define her happiness. She was enough on her own. The journey of picking up the pieces wasn't easy, but every day she got stronger. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She was someone who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and was ready to embrace the future with confidence. Years passed, and the bride's life slowly became brighter. She had moved on, and although there were still moments of sadness, she had built a new, fulfilling life. But for the groom, the years that followed the wedding disaster were far less kind. At first, he thought leaving her was the right decision. He was convinced that he was doing what was best for both of them, though deep down, he always had doubts. The guilt didn't hit him immediately. He continued with his life, going through the motions, but something inside him was missing. He had no idea just how much he had lost that day. Life hadn't turned out the way he had imagined. His career had not flourished like he hoped, and he found himself feeling isolated. The woman who had once been his entire world was now just a distant memory. His friends and family, once supportive, began to drift away. He felt lonely and regretful, wondering if he had made the right choice in walking away from her. It was during one quiet evening when he was going through old pictures that he stumbled upon a photo of the bride, the woman he had left at the altar. The memories came flooding back, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to reflect on everything he had lost. He remembered the way she smiled, the warmth in her eyes, and the love they had shared. He recalled how proud he had been to be with her, and how certain he had been that they were meant to be together. But then he remembered the wedding day, the way he had rejected her, humiliated her in front of everyone. His heart sank as he realized the depth of his mistake. How had he been so foolish? The years of regret began to weigh heavily on him. He thought about what she had become, strong, successful, and admired. He thought about the life they could have had together if he hadn't let his insecurities take over. The groom had tried to move on, but it was never the same. No relationship had ever come close to the connection he had shared with her. The love they once had felt like a lost treasure, something he had cast aside without truly understanding its value. He had once been so sure of his decision, but now, with the benefit of time and distance, the truth was undeniable. He had made the worst mistake of his life. One evening, as he was flipping through a magazine, something caught his eye. The cover of the magazine showed a woman he recognized instantly, the bride, the woman he had left at the altar. She was on the cover of a well-known publication, smiling confidently, looking more successful and beautiful than ever. Her name was right there in the headline. He stared at the photo for several moments, unable to look away. The woman he had discarded had become a successful figure in her field, admired by many. The sight of her on the magazine cover shocked him to his core. He felt a pang of jealousy mixed with awe. She had done it. She had become everything he had never believed she could be. She had risen above the hurt, above the heartbreak, and turned her life into something extraordinary. The regret he felt deepened. He realized that not only had he lost her love, but he had also lost the chance to stand beside her, to be part of her journey. He couldn't stop thinking about it. How had she become so successful? How had she healed so completely while he had remained stuck in his own regret? The thought of her thriving without him was both painful and inspiring. He knew one thing for sure. He could never undo the damage he had caused. But seeing her on that magazine cover made him understand just how badly he had misjudged her, and just how much he had missed. The years had passed, but for the bride, time had been both a healer and a teacher. Though the scars of her past were still there, she no longer allowed them to control her. She had transformed from the broken woman who had been left at the altar into someone unrecognizable to even herself. The pain, the heartbreak, the humiliation, those things no longer defined her. Instead, she had built a life of strength, success, and purpose. She had thrown herself into her career. Her work became her focus, her passion. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when doubt would creep in, but she pushed through. She excelled in her field, gaining recognition for her hard work and talent. The young woman who had once walked down the aisle with dreams of a happy future now stood tall as a confident, accomplished professional. She had become a force to be reckoned with in her industry, admired by peers and respected by those who had once doubted her. Her personal life, too, had changed. The woman who had once lived with a sense of longing for the man who had rejected her now lived with a deep sense of fulfillment. She had friends who supported her, colleagues who valued her, and a sense of peace that came from knowing she had rebuilt herself from the ground up. She was no longer waiting for anyone to give her happiness. She had found it within herself. There were moments, of course, when she would think back to that fateful day. She would remember the pain of standing alone at the altar, surrounded by guests who had witnessed her heart being torn apart. But even in those moments of reflection, she didn't feel sorrow. Instead, she felt pride in how far she had come. She had learned that life was not about waiting for things to fall into place, but about taking charge and making them happen. As the years went on, her transformation became more and more apparent to those around her. People who had known her in the past marveled at how much she had changed. They admired her strength, her resilience, and her ability to turn what had been a tragedy into a triumph. The woman who had once been seen as the one who was left behind had become an inspiration to many. She had rewritten her own story, and in doing so, she had found her true self. But it wasn't just her career or her social life that had transformed. Her heart had healed too. The deep wound left by the groom's rejection had scared her, but it had also given her the wisdom and clarity to understand her own worth. She no longer needed anyone to define her happiness. She had learned to love herself, something she hadn't known how to do before. She had become a woman who could stand on her own, proud of who she was and what she had achieved. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones we achieve for ourselves, without anyone else's approval or validation. And with each passing day, she became stronger, more confident, and more certain that the life she was building was the one she was meant to live. Looking back, she realized that the rejection, the heartbreak, and the pain had all played a role in shaping the woman she had become. Without them, she might never have found the strength to become the person she was today. And for that, she was grateful. She had learned to rise above her past and embrace her future, and nothing at all, could take that away from her. One evening, years after the wedding day disaster, the groom sat in his apartment, flipping through a magazine. Life hadn't turned out the way he had expected. His career was not where he wanted it to be, and his personal life was empty. Friends who had once supported him now rarely reached out, and loneliness seemed to follow him wherever he went. The carefree man who had once thought he had everything under control now felt lost. As he turned the pages of the magazine, his eyes stopped on one particular cover. There, in front of him, was the woman he had once been so sure he was going to marry. The woman he had left standing at the altar. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. She looked stunning. The woman who had once been rejected by him was now a picture of success and confidence, gracing the cover of a major magazine. The headline read, "A Rising Star. The woman who overcame the impossible." He stared at the photo, unable to look away. She was standing tall, her eyes bright and filled with purpose. It was the same woman he had walked away from, but she looked different now. She had changed in a way that took him completely by surprise. The woman he had discarded was now a force in her own right, someone who had taken the pain of her past and turned it into something powerful. As he studied the magazine cover, the memories began to flood back. He remembered the day they met, the laughter they shared, and how he had once felt so sure that they would build a future together. But somewhere along the way, doubt and fear had crept in. He had been unsure of himself, of the future, and so he had made the terrible decision to leave her. He remembered her face on that fateful day, standing at the altar, her eyes full of shock and heartbreak as he rejected her. He had thought that by walking away, he was doing the right thing. But now, looking at her on the cover of that magazine, he realized how wrong he had been. The woman he had pushed aside was now thriving. She had moved forward, built a life, and succeeded in ways he never could have imagined. A mix of guilt and admiration washed over him. How could he have been so blind? She had always been capable, always been strong. He had seen the potential in her once, but somehow, in that moment of fear and uncertainty, he had let her go. Now it was clear that she had taken everything he once saw in her and turned it into something extraordinary. The regret he felt in that moment was overwhelming. He wondered how many opportunities he had missed, how many chances he had let slip away. She had become everything he could have hoped for and more. He thought about all the other relationships he had been in since, none of which had ever felt right. None of them had ever compared to the connection he once had with her. For the first time in years, the groom thought about reaching out to her. But what could he possibly say? What words could undo the damage he had caused? The distance between them had grown too wide, and there was no easy way to bridge the gap. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something irreplaceable. He sat there for a long time, staring at the magazine cover, feeling both proud and deeply regretful. She had become everything he had never expected. And now, he realized, he was the one who had lost. As the weeks went by, the groom couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the magazine cover. Her image was constantly in his mind, a reminder of everything he had once had and everything he had lost. The regret grew heavier with each passing day, gnawing at him from the inside. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he had to live with the consequences. Every time he saw her name in the news or heard someone mention her achievements, a feeling of guilt settled deep in his stomach. He couldn't help but wonder how she had managed to move on so completely while he was stuck in the past, regretting his actions. How had she healed? How had she turned her pain into something so beautiful and successful? He admired her strength, but it only made him feel more ashamed of how he had treated her. He began to look back at their relationship with new eyes. He thought about the way she had supported him, believed in him, and encouraged him. She had always been the one to lift him up when he felt down, the one who saw the best in him when he couldn't see it in himself. But instead of appreciating all of that, he had pushed her away. He had let his doubts and insecurities dictate his decisions. He hadn't been strong enough to see her value. And now he was paying the price. It wasn't just her success that made him feel guilty. It was the way he had treated her on that day, the day he left her at the altar. He thought back to her face, how hurt and confused she had been. He had watched her break down in front of everyone, and instead of comforting her or trying to explain, he had turned his back and walked away. It was the lowest point of his life, and he couldn't believe how cruel he had been. The thought of her standing there, alone and rejected, haunted him every night. He wondered if she ever thought about him, if she ever looked back at their relationship with the same regret. He had always imagined that she would forget about him, move on, and live a happy life. But now, as he saw her success, he realized that she had done more than just move on. She had thrived. She had become the woman he had always known she could be, and it was painful to accept that he wasn't a part of that journey. The guilt became a constant companion, following him wherever he went. He couldn't escape it. He knew he could never go back and change what had happened, but he wondered if there was anything he could do now. Could he reach out to her? Could he somehow make amends for the way he had treated her? He considered writing a letter, expressing his regret and apologizing for his actions, but what good would it do? Would she even want to hear from him? Part of him wanted to apologize, to tell her how much he admired everything she had become. But another part of him was afraid that it was too late, that the distance between them had grown too wide. One thing was clear: he had lost something precious. He had let go of a love that could have been, and now he was left with nothing but the painful memory of what could have been his. And no amount of regret could change that. As the months passed, the groom's regret only grew. The more he thought about the woman he had left behind, the more he realized how much he had lost. The image of her on the magazine cover still haunted him, but now he no longer saw just the success she had achieved. He saw the person she had been, the woman he had once loved and foolishly walked away from. One evening, after much thought, he decided he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He had to do something, even if it was just to let her know how sorry he was. He had wronged her in ways words couldn't describe, but he had to at least try to make things right. He spent hours writing a letter, carefully choosing his words. He wanted to express his deepest regrets, to tell her how much he had come to understand his mistakes. The letter wasn't long, but it was sincere. He wrote about how he had always admired her strength and resilience, and how, over the years, he had realized just how much she had meant to him. He confessed that leaving her had been the biggest mistake of his life, and that he deeply regretted the hurt he had caused her. He didn't expect forgiveness. He knew that was something he couldn't take back, but he hoped that somehow she would understand how truly sorry he was. Once the letter was written, he sat with it for a long time, unsure of what to do next. Sending it felt like a risk. What if she didn't want to hear from him? What if she had moved on completely and didn't care about his apology? He could only hope that the woman he had once known was still somewhere inside the person she had become, and that she would see his words as genuine. After much hesitation, he decided to send the letter. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that he had to do something. He had to take the first step, even if it was small. Days passed, and he waited anxiously, wondering if she would reply. He thought about the possibility of rejection, but deep down, he knew that sending the letter was the right thing to do. It wasn't about expecting forgiveness. It was about taking responsibility for his actions. It was about showing her that he had learned from his mistakes, even if it was too late. Finally, he received a response. It wasn't exactly what he had expected, but it wasn't what he had feared either. She had written back, and in her words, he could sense that she had taken the time to think carefully before replying. She thanked him for his apology and acknowledged the pain that both of them had experienced. But she made it clear that while she appreciated his words, she had moved on. She had built a life for herself, one that didn't need him in it. She had found peace and happiness on her own, and she wasn't looking back. Reading her response, the groom felt a mix of emotions. There was relief in knowing that she had at least heard him out, but there was also a sense of finality. The door that had once been open between them was now firmly closed. She had healed, and her life was moving forward without him. While the response wasn't what he had hoped for, it gave him a sense of clarity. He realized that some things can never be fixed, no matter how much regret you carry. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go and allow the other person to move forward with their life. He knew now that he had done all he could. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still ahead, and he would carry this lesson with him for the rest of his life. Months passed since the groom had sent the letter, and life moved on for both of them. The woman he had left at the altar had continued to thrive in her career and personal life, leaving behind the painful memories of the past. She had built a future for herself, strong and independent. She had learned to love herself, to put her dreams first, and to never look back at the man who had broken her heart. The groom, on the other hand, had spent the months after receiving her response in quiet reflection. Her words, while not what he had hoped for, had given him a sense of peace. He knew now that his apology had been heard, even if it hadn't changed anything. There were no more chances for them to be together. It had been too late, and her life had already moved on. But even with that understanding, he couldn't shake the thought of seeing her one last time. He wondered how she was doing, what her life was like now. Was she happy? Did she ever think about him, even just for a moment? He had spent so long living with regret, and now part of him wanted closure. He had already apologized, but he needed to see her face to face, to truly understand that their past was behind them. He didn't know if she would agree to meet him. He had no right to ask for anything more, but the desire to see her one last time stayed with him. After careful thought, he reached out once more. He didn't know if she would say yes, but he felt that he had to ask. It wasn't about trying to get back together. It was about understanding, about both of them finding peace. To his surprise, she agreed to meet. They set a time and place, a quiet cafe in the city. When the day came, the groom's heart raced with nervous anticipation. This meeting wasn't about rekindling the past. It was about acknowledging the past, learning from it, and moving forward, separately. As he arrived at the cafe, he saw her sitting at a table by the window. She was just as beautiful as he remembered, but there was something different about her now. Her eyes were calm and full of confidence. She didn't look angry or upset. She simply looked at peace. She had become the woman he had always known she could be, someone strong, capable, and independent. They exchanged greetings, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with the weight of everything that had happened between them. Finally, the groom spoke. "I just wanted to thank you again," he said, his voice soft, "for hearing me out and for giving me the chance to apologize. I know I can never make up for what I did, but I hope you know that I'm truly sorry." She nodded, a small smile on her face. "I appreciate your words," she replied calmly. "I'm glad you found a way to move forward. We both have. And I've learned to let go of the past. I think it's best that we both keep moving forward with our own lives." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just the simple truth that they had both moved on. Her words were the final confirmation that their chapter had closed. She had forgiven him, but she had long since forgiven herself. She had learned that she was worthy of happiness, that her life was hers to live, and that no one, not even the man who had once loved her, could take that away. As they said their goodbyes and parted ways, the groom felt a sense of relief. There was no longer a weight pressing down on him. The closure he needed was finally there. The past was behind them, and both of them were ready to embrace the future. He walked away, knowing that the most important thing was to continue learning, to keep growing, and to never forget the lesson that life had taught him. Some things can never be undone, but we can always choose how we move forward.